The Nipigon River is an incredibly wild river that's, despite having 3 dams on it, remains incredibly beautiful and magical in some odd way. But there is something about it that is unusual.
Like last summer we went there and actually we had a ceremony out there. And across the river were little people and they were doing their celebration over there. There were eagles just soaring and it was so, it was just wonderful. And these birds would come and check us out. And then over on this side there would be different birds as if they were congregating and they were just listening to what was going on. And then when the drumming started, well, they were all more agitated and so were these things across the way. They were just little tiny people, and that was it when the drumming stopped and they just faded and they were gone. All sorts of things happen on that river.
My favorite thing about the river, I would say the scenery and the fishing. Kind of the two go together. Favorite area of the river is without a doubt the Split Rock area. It still looks pretty well the way it was back in the 1800s. It hasn't been altered by the dams very much. And in the early mornings, if you get there early morning when the mist is rising, there's no other place on earth. It's just beautiful.
The funny thing about when you're on the Nipigon River, even though it seems like a pretty wild place, there's the signs of its history are everywhere. The cables in the rock, the logs all over the bottom, and yet it still is a pretty wild place. And somehow nature has managed to win out over all that we've done to it, really, in some ways.
Brook trout are one of the most beautiful game fish in the world. Their spectacular colors, spirited fighting, and exceptional taste are unsurpassed. And here on the Nipigon River you will find the largest in the world.
I've lived here since I was 4 years old, and I'm going on 83 right now. So I first started fishing it when I was probably about 9 years old, just with my father. But then I started fly fishing when I was about 12 years old. And I'd catch a lot of speckled trout right underneath the Nipigon River bridge out of there. I'd catch, like closer to shore, I'd catch the smaller ones. And every now and again I'd catch one up to maybe 2 pounds. But later on, as I got a little bit better and a little bit bigger at it, then I'd fish the heavier water, and then I would get them up to 5 pounds fly fishing. But you come across places that were really good for speckled trout, like Parmachine and all the most of the corners and everything else of the river. It was tremendous speckled trout fishing.
When you were a kid, that was something to be able to hook something and feel that tugging. Now it's just for the pleasure of being on the water, being on the river especially, and it's peaceful and you get, I don't know, I guess you get a natural high out of it just by being here. To catch fish still is part of being out here and experiencing that, but I don't think it's even catching a big one anymore. But to feel a fish, I don't know, I guess it's something that's instilled in you and you just love to do it.
Since the 1800s, the Nipigon River has been a favorite destination for anglers from around the world. Traveling to Nipigon, avid anglers made their way to the river for a fishing experience like no other. A variety of fish live in the waters. However, the one fish that they came for was the Nipigon River brook trout.
For whatever reason, brook trout have always had an appeal for people. It was just, they were the glory fish. They were the sort of the marquee fish. So people came a long ways here because they knew that the Nipigon River, it was a fantastic place to catch brook trout. And for whatever reason, people came a long, long ways to do it,
Well, it's famous because the fish are exceptionally large, and back in the 1800s there were large numbers of large fish. So And the brook trout being a good game fish and good to eat, it attracted people. They wanted to come here and see these. This was the best fishing stream on earth. And that reputation is actually carried on even to this day. In my job as a biologist here in Nipigon, I would get calls from people that just wanted to cast a line into the Nipigon River, that it's that famous, and it's continued to be that famous.
The stories of huge catches of brook trout weighing as much as 9 pounds was such an attraction that fishing the Nipigon quickly became the source of a thriving business. Local outfitters supplied the gentlemen anglers with tents, canoes, and other necessary equipment. Attracted to the river by countless articles in guidebooks and magazines, the rich and famous President Theodore Roosevelt, Edward, Prince of Wales, senators, railway barons, and Hollywood celebrities all came to be guided and pampered while enjoying the incredible scenery and unsurpassed fishing on the Nipigon River, the finest trout stream in the world.
So at that time, the river was only for the elite, the gentlemen anglers, as they were being called at that time. These were wealthy people that had some leisure time on their hands. They'd made lots of money through the latter parts of the Industrial Revolution. Had in fact made it so that there was, wealthy business owners in the United States and overseas that were looking to spend some money. So the outfitters here locally were targeting these people and providing services for these people, and they were charging lots for it. In fact, some of the articles describe that you have to pay city prices and downtown New York prices to come here, per day, but the scenery was way nicer.
The Ontario government even cashed in on the river, requiring anglers to obtain a special license in order to fish the Nipigon. In 1901, this license cost the non-resident fishermen $15 for 2 weeks, the equivalent of paying $400 today. Resident anglers paid $5 for 2 weeks, equivalent to $125 today. Another large part of the expenditure was hiring local, skilled guides. Guiding was the major source of income for local First Nations people. 2 guides were hired for each tourist. In 1887, a lead guide made $2.50 a day, the equivalent of $62 today, but prices were negotiable.
The guides were all local First Nation people from the surrounding areas, some from Pays Plat, many from up on Lake Nipigon, and a lot locally here from the Red Rock Indian Band. And they would come here and spend their season, the open water season here, as guides working for these outfitters. And they were highly skilled people that knew how to run the rapids, knew where those fish were, and they were really held in high esteem and highly respected for their bush skills.
My grandfather's name was Andrew Lexie, and he was one of those famous people. Not famous to the point of being recognized on sight, but he was our hero, I guess you could call him. He was born at Poplar Point, and him and his mother moved here when he was just a little boy, and they lived somewhere across from where the church is today. They lived out there in their teepee, I guess, or wigwam, or whatever it was. He was the guide of many, many different people, but he was a helper in the community, and he'd take Jesuits up the river, and he'd even go as far as James Bay by canoe. He didn't know how to read or write. There was no education back then. Education was very limited to our people, but yet today when I speak to some educated people, I find him still to be the smartest person that I've met.
Andrew Lexie was a legendary lead guide who made his living guiding anglers on the Nipigon River. He's credited for guiding celebrities such as Prince Arthur, the Duke of Connaught, and Edward, Prince of Wales. Andrew Lexie was also the favorite guide of Dr. J.W. Cook of Fort William.
What I know about Dr. Cook is, what I've read. and he was very well known in Fort William, which now Thunder Bay. You know, extremely well known doctor. I clearly loved to fly fish, avid angler, and fished the Nipigon River.
Dr. John Cook was a very distinguished man. He was a general practitioner who delivered over 2,000 babies, was district coroner, traveled as team doctor with many sports teams, and was active throughout the community with many civic organizations. In fact, over 1,000 people attended his funeral.
Dr. Cook was an avid fisherman. He loved to fish, he loved the outdoors, and so a regular part of his enjoyment, and likely the reason he stayed so long in Thunder Bay and Fort William, is the fact that he had great access to the outdoors. So he came to Nipigon a couple of times a year. That was his annual trip. You know, when 1915 rolled around and he and his friends came out to Nipigon, they had planned a 10-day canoe trip up the Nipigon River and climbed on the train, you know, July 15th of 1915 to come out for what was kind of an annual trip that they took.
On July 15, 1915, the angling group signed the Nipigon Forest Reserve Registry and started to make their way upstream under the guidance of Andrew Lexie. Traveling and fishing on the river for 6 days, they had reached Rabbit Rapids in the upper reaches of the Nipigon when Dr. Cook made the cast of a lifetime.
Well, he must have been pretty ecstatic knowing he had a big fish. And just being a fisherman, you're always wondering, oh, I hope it don't get off till I see what it is. Because it could have been a pike, could have been a lake trout, could have been anything. But when he probably seen that it was a brook trout and he seen the size of it, he must have been, yeah, pretty ecstatic for sure.
I imagine he knew right away he had a giant fish because he was using a 5-weight bamboo rod. Now, I've used 5-weight regular fly rods and caught large fish with them, and it's crazy. Like, he must have known he had something special on. I imagine it was a pretty exciting experience, and I imagine when that fish came in and the guides were saying this extraordinary fish, and he was looking at it, and giant brook trout, it must have been something.
It is kind of a thrill. First of all, when you have one hit your bait, you can, with the experience, you can almost tell roughly what size it is. And when you hook one and you haven't seen it yet and your rod is bending pretty good, then there's a kind of a thrill behind that. And hopefully you can see it before it gets off.
To land it and see it, then wonder, oh my God, he probably didn't know he really had the world record. He knew he had a big fish, but yeah, I can sort of put myself in that place thinking, wow, if I ever hook something like that, that would be something for sure.
When they finally landed it, none of the guides and none of the fishing party, Dr. Cook included, could believe that it was a brook trout. Although it looked like a brook trout, it was so large that the only thing they could believe it to be was a lake trout. And they actually sent downstream to get the head guide from the next party, Joe Wodeau, to come up and actually look at it and get us kind of another opinion as to what this fish was.
Weighing in at 14.5 pounds, Dr. Cook's brook trout was 31.5 inches long and had a girth of 23 inches. At that time, with the average size of a brook trout caught in the river being approximately 2.5 pounds, this was still an extraordinarily huge brook trout. Because this fish was larger than any brook trout ever seen, the skin was removed and sent immediately to fisheries experts in Ottawa for species verification. When experts confirmed that this fish was in fact a brook trout, Dr. Cook was given the title of a world record holder, a record that would remain unbreakable for the next 100 years.
Compared to any day's brook trout, that was a massive fish. The amazing thing is that the very next day, Dr. Cook caught a double catch and set another record, unheard of and unequaled to my knowledge to this day, in that he caught 2 fish on one cast, and he caught one brook trout that was 6 3/5 pounds, as it was recorded, and another fish that was 5 1/10 pounds. Those fish were mounted as well and are on display to this day up in Thunder Bay at the museum there.
The fish skin was mounted on birch bark. a tradition that originated in the late 1800s and was unique to the Nipigon River. The mounted fish was quickly adopted by the railways as a poster child to promote rail tourism. Dr. Cook's brook trout traveled widely across North America, as it was annually paraded to tourism shows from the 1920s until its last showing at the Toronto Sportsman Show in 1989. In 1942, Field and Stream magazine incorrectly reported the world record to have been caught in 1916. Subsequent articles have repeated this error. The caption on the mount was changed to 1916, sometime prior to 1978, when the mount was returned to Nipigon.
After we got it, we had it on display, and then it got put into a new Melamie case, beautiful setup. And that was in 1989. It obviously had been touched up by a taxidermist when it was at the Sportsman Show. And then we got it back and we had it in this beautiful display case. And then we had the fire and it burnt.
On February 11, 1990, the Nipigon Museum had a devastating fire. Many of the museum's collections were destroyed. Among the wreckage was Dr. Cook's world record brook trout.
Nightmares. There was no place you could look in your mind that wasn't black, because it was so black. There was white outside, you go inside and you're all black. I couldn't talk about it, couldn't think about it in the morning. You had to keep your mouth shut or you'd go into tears. But it was about a month before we could reach the area where it was, because the fire was so close to it. The whole building was very unstable in that part, and there was no floor. We brought it to the arena and let it melt out. And it was as you see it now, not much there, but some parts of it there. And then we've had it on display ever since.
It's because it's our area, it's our heritage here of this river, that big world record brook trout. Yeah, I guess it is something. You never thought of it before as it'd be this, famous. But because it is the world record, in any fish, a world record is something.
Well, I think we're talking about this 100-year-old fish because it was such a massive trout, and most of the brook trout that people are familiar with are small. They're familiar with creek fish that only, grow to be 14 inches long. When I grew up, where I grew up in central Ontario, a big fish was 14 inches long. In fact, you jumped on your bicycle and pedaled like oh heck for home there so you could show off one of that size. So I think for a lot of people that's kind of a typical brook trout. So one this big is still mind-boggling for people.
There's world records fall fairly regularly. A lot of the world records, like for instance, muskie records, have been debunked, and people still catch big fish. But for whatever reason, the brook trout record has held. And despite there's been some very large brook trout caught over the years, but nothing has really come close to Dr. Cook's fish that I've seen. And the situation now in the world is that there's not a lot of places where there's the kind of water that would support brook trout that would grow to 14.5 pounds basically. So it's a very old record. It's held up. It's never really been, as far as I know, it's never been questioned. It's never really been threatened, and it's just amazing something that lasts 100 years.
The Nipigon River was truly in its glory. Already world-renowned for its beauty and great fishing, the world record catch was the cherry on top. However, with the massive number of anglers visiting the Nipigon and the lack of regulations to protect the fishery, it did not take long for the river to face a decline in its brook trout population.
This was an incredibly productive area for brook trout because of the natural springs, because of the way the river was designed, and there's lots of feed in this particular river. And one of the things about these brook trout is the numbers have plummeted over the last 100 years.
The first reference to the river being overfished is in 1889. An A.R. McDonough wrote an article for the Out of Doors Library, as it was called, Scribner's Magazine published, and in that he says that the fishing today is not the way it was 20 years ago. Other articles have said this river's so big and there's so many fish it could never be fished out. He was the first to say, we've got a problem here, action needs to be taken, and he said, unless it is cherished, the glory of the Nipigon may fade and the stories of its marvelous attractions may become a tradition of the past. And those were words that have rung out and actually have been shown to be true through time. The next few years were, in fact, serious declines occurred for a variety of reasons.
That was one factor. Another factor, no doubt, would have been the development of the dams. And when you dam a river system, it affects the entire the system and affects spawning areas, it affects food abundance and so on. And what we've seen is that the numbers have decreased since the dam's gone in.
The whole river would have been different. Like before it got flooded back, you know, it would have been full of rapids, full of pools. At the start, I always thought it was overfishing because everybody did keep their fish. But what I didn't know was the low water levels was the big thing. And their spawning areas were high and dry because the hydro was letting the water down in the vulnerable time of the spring when hot water naturally should be high, you know? And they had it lowered, and I seen it for myself where the spawn bed was high and dry and the little brook trout were just living in the spring. That little bit of water that's coming out of the spring, and if the water would have been up, they would have been able to swim into the lake. But with the water low, they were like 5 to 10 feet away from the main lake, so they would have all died.
Brook trout are really unique in their needs for groundwater upwelling through gravel. They come in the fall to spawn, they turn on their sides and dig a depression in the gravel over these springs and deposit their eggs in there. They cover the eggs back up, and then those eggs incubate right through from October or November through to the spring and hatch out around April, May period. If anything happens to that water level during the winter months when they're incubating, those fish are destroyed.
Overfishing and habitat destruction nearly eliminated the brook trout. With help from Nipigon locals, the Ministry of Natural Resources put regulations in place to help protect the fish. Today, due to strict fishing regulations and a changing angler ethic, most brook trout are live released. Water level agreements with the Ontario Power Generation have been negotiated, and fish sanctuaries have been established around spawning areas. While the fishery can never be restored to its former glory, thanks to ongoing restoration efforts by the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources that began in 1988, brook trout numbers are increasing and recovery is underway. Anglers assisted by tagging and tracking their fish, which helped to prove the fish could survive being live released. After years of neglect, the Nipigon River and its fishery was finally seeing improvement.
It's radically better than it was in the 80s. It's not like now I would go out and expect to catch what I consider a trophy brook trout on most days, which is pretty amazing, because that wasn't the case in the early 80s. It wasn't even the case in the early 90s, really. And what's really been neat is to see them move into places that like I'd fished for years and years and go, why isn't there ever a brook trout here? And like this should be a brook trout spot. And now all of a sudden it is a brook trout spot because there's enough fish that they've started to populate places. There's enough of them that they can live in more spots.
Yeah, I think, and education I think is going to be a big one too, to educate kids and the public for live releasing, because you know you don't see that ever, and most people only learn that by doing it. But if there is some education on it, would save a lot of fish too, because it's a small system really. It is a big river, but it is a small system, and there's only so many fish out there. And with the added pressure now, because the fishing's good, is we're gonna have to do a good job at trying to keep these fish alive.
My hopes for the Nipigon River in the future is, especially for my grandchildren, great-grandchildren, so on, that they will be able to experience the same experience I've had during my lifetime. You don't want to see it destroyed at all. And in order to keep it the way it is, we have to make sure that the water levels are controlled and that the live release is kept. Otherwise, it would be a failure if we didn't.
Through the efforts of what M&R did with regulations and working with hydro, they managed to regulate flow in water, which especially during the crucial spawning times, that make sure they have the water flowing at the right levels. So there are efforts being put in place by protecting the spawning areas, by working with hydro to regulate the water flow, and all those things contribute to the recovery of the brook trout.
I think more than anything we need to learn from the past, like overfishing and the building of these dams and the habitat destruction that occurred as a result of building those dams has led to the decline of that fishery. Live release and better water management has led to the recovery. And we need to keep that in mind and remember that these fish, we put them through a lot. They need to be treated with the respect that they deserve. They're still here by good luck. If in fact we continue to live release, and if water management continues to improve as it has, there's no reason we can't improve this fishery continuously through time.
Unless it is cherished, the glory of the Nipigon may fade, and the stories of its marvelous attractions may become a tradition of the past.